Hi, my name is Arnold Mueller from GenRight Off-Road, and we're going to show you how to install your GenRight JL or JT front aluminum inner fenders, the TFF 10 EIF or HIF. We're going to start by removing the wheel for easy access of the inner fender. Now we're going to remove the factory fender flare and inner fender. It's a few 10mm headed bolts and a plug, and you kind of just pull it off. So he's got all the clips removed, the light is unplugged, and he's pulling the inner fender well out from behind the shock tower and coil bucket to access a few more clips. So we just removed 4 M6 bolts with a 10mm socket, unclipped the plastic retaining clips, was able to tilt the fender flare outward to unplug the light plug located here. The last few clips you can't get to, so you just have to pull it off and they'll just break off and no damage to the fender at all. To remove the factory washer bottle, there's 2 M10 headed bolts and 1 M10 headed nut and a plug. We're gonna tuck these wires up just to keep them out of our way. We're gonna be working in this area, so we need those wires in a safe place. Next, we're going to be removing all these fender mounting tabs. These you can grab with a tool, maybe just your hand, and break them off. And these you're gonna use a cutting wheel to slice them, break them off as well. The last part of our disassembly will be removing this plastic vent. 2 clips on the back and it should just pop right out. You will locate the fender cutting template, which is this guy right here. And you will use a razor blade, X-Acto knife, and trim along this line, cut these holes out, cut all the holes out. Cut all those holes out, and it will look something like this. You will then be laying this over your fender flare and cutting and marking the holes that are in the fender, those 3 right there, and you're going to go ahead and mark the line. I like to mark a few points on the line and then grab a straight edge and complete that line. This line will run tangent into the arc that is at the top of the fender. Right there. It will run in, it will flow into that. So now that we've cut off that wedge, we're going to center punch all these holes and drill them out. So this is our backing plate for the GenRight tube fender. We just got finished cutting the tube fender at this angle, cutting that wedge off, and now we have to match that cut on this backing plate. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stick some bolts through so I can align it with the tube fender. I'm going to line up the edge so that the reveal is the same, and I'm going to mark this cut. You will also want to mark these holes. Now that the fender flare has been cut and drilled, we're going to hold it up to the Jeep to determine which factory holes will be reused for rib nuts or through bolts. So we're gonna hold it up and mark which holes will be reused, either with a rib nut or a through bolt. These 3 here will be getting a through bolt. These will be getting rib nuts. The holes with the blue marks will get a through bolt. And you can go ahead and install rib nuts in those marked holes. You want to locate your upper fender reinforcement bracket. This is the left side or the driver's side, and you will notice that it slips in right there. The fender flare will need to get installed and uninstalled a few times, so you just have to put in about 3 bolts to hold it in place. Now that the upper fender reinforcement bracket is bolted to the fender flare through the factory fender, we can go ahead and mark these holes into the factory fender support so that we can drill and install 3/8 riv nuts into there. While the fender flare is still installed, it's a good time to mark this cut onto the factory fender and also the holes that we will be drilling. I like to mark the fender only up until the bottom of the flare and then cut straight across. The rest you will cut later when the reinforcement bracket is in there. To mark those back holes, what I like to do is I like to use a Milwaukee marker. You take the tip off and then you can use just that to mark the back of it. At the same time, mark these. Now that we've marked our cut and our holes, we can remove the fender flare. So if you take a look at our marks right here, these holes circled in blue will get drilled to 5/16, getting a through bolt into our lower fender reinforcement bracket, while these 2 holes will be getting 1/4-20 riv nuts. So this is the lower fender reinforcement bracket. It gets inserted into behind the factory fender like so, links up with these through bolts, and that's why we have to trim this piece off. This cut will continue all the way down, but for now, we're going to leave that uncut and only cut in this blue region. Next, you're gonna locate your inner left or driver's side cutting template, and you're gonna cut it out like so. You wanna cut out the holes, cut around the edge, and also little areas so you can mark through into the sheet metal. After cutting your inner template, you're going to hold it up to the pinch seam on the inside of the fender, line it up with this tab here, line the hole up, and line the entire edge up with the sheet metal. There's a little tick here that will line up with the center of that hole. You will then mark the 2 holes that will need to get drilled. And also mark the inner cut. We're going to now cut the outside and the inside of the fender. These holes are going to be through bolts, and the factory fender is going to be sandwiched between the GenRight tube fender and the reinforcement bracket. So it would help to blow these holes out to almost 3/8 if needed to get the bracket to align better. Now that we've trimmed the outside and the inside of the fender, we can remove this bracket and drill the last hole there. Open up these holes if needed and reinstall the reinforcement bracket. We're then going to move to installing the upper fender reinforcement bracket. We're going to be using a 17/32 to drill out the holes in here for a 3/8/16 rib nut. 3 of them. For these 3/8 rib nuts, we're going to use this rib nut installation tool made out of a bolt, a nut, and some washers. Now that the rib nuts are inserted, we're going to go ahead and install our upper reinforcement bracket. This is the front of the inner fender tie-in bracket, and it bolts right there. You'll see how it lines up with the bottom edge of the factory sheet metal perfectly. You can either put a through bolt and a nut on the back, or you can drill it and put a rib nut in. We're going to put a rib nut in that. Assembling the inner fenders will require you to rivet the mesh panels behind the inner fender. If you lay out all of the mesh panels, you will notice that there's a smooth side and there's a slightly rougher side. That's just the direction that it gets punched in. The smooth side is what you want facing outward. outward of the vehicle. All of the mesh panels have holes lasered in for the rivet. You'll find them on almost all the corners. And you will use the supplied 1/8" rivets and a rivet gun to assemble the panels. Now that we have all the mesh panels installed, we can go ahead and test fit the inner fender onto the Jeep. So you're gonna grab some 1/4-20 bolts and a T-handle and get to it. This one will sit approximately right there behind the GenRight tube fender. So just make sure those bolts are loose enough to be able to wedge this piece of inner fender behind the tube fender on top of the factory fender. And it should just slide right up in there. Make sure you have your bolts loose, and this should just wedge right behind the GenRight tube fender and the factory fender. This panel goes right here. So we have this quick release bracket that will bolt to the top of this and wedge behind the fender, the tube fender as well. You can see here the final product installed on a vehicle with the tube fender painted in white and the inner fender in black, but you could paint or powder coat to any color that you want.